Hello, everyone. We're pleased that you could join us today. Pull up a chair and sit with us a while. We're going to reminisce a bit on our program today and take you back a step in time. Most of us have memories that seem to cross our minds in our quiet times, perhaps the most vivid memories stored in the back roads of our mind, or memories of our childhood, or perhaps the neighborhood in which we were raised. I would like to share some of my memories with you of a bygone era in which I shared by living in a section of the city called West Hill. I think most of us agree that memories have a way of entering into our homes, whether invited or not. I was not particularly inspired to write this account, but compiled it assuming that some former Hill resident, along with me, might like to reminisce a bit. Perhaps these memories might also pique your interest, and who knows, there might be an old West Hiller watching. These comments are offered solely from memory of one who lived on the hill during this point in time, and not offered as being inherent in accuracy, but presented as reflections from a distant past. Memories of people, places, and things that are brought to mind would be those of the early 1900s, BT, before television. The hill at this time was populated mostly by German and Dutch immigrants and their descendants who either worked in the sash and door factories or the button factories. During this era, the main artery of activity on the hill was Lucas Street, which extended from Cherry Street to Hauser Street. There were various businesses scattered along this busy street and also at other locations on the hill. These would have included 5 grocery stores, a florist, 2 button-cutting shops, a salve maker, and a poultry farm. Also located on this street were 2 churches, St. Mary's and the Church of the Brethren. One can recall the ice cream socials held in the St. Mary's churchyard. The yard would be ablaze with lighted bulbs, which were surrounded by innumerable flitting moths. These socials brought families together, which were not all members of the church, but neighbors brought together for fellowship and to enjoy what the social had for sale. Also brought to mind was the ringing of the bells in the St. Mary's clock tower, which told the hour and perhaps told a playing child that he might be a bit late for supper. The clarity and resonance of the ringing bells was apparent on a cold winter night when all outside was quiet and still. St. Mary's, of course, has been active these many years. The Church of the Brethren, having been discontinued as a church, has other tenants in the building at present. Many West Hill kids attended their first Sunday school class in this small wooden church and can recall the Christmas programs presented by various Sunday school classes and also the gift of a sack of hardtack Christmas candy. Of the 5 grocery stores located on Lucas Street, one was owned and operated by a sightless man named Mr. Landless. It was constantly a source of mystery to a small boy how this sightless man could retrieve a specific item from the grocery shelves, and also how he was able to determine money denominations and make correct change. This former store building is still standing, but has been converted into a dwelling. Another store that was popular on the hill was located on Clymer Street. Actually, it was a combination grocery and meat market and operated by a Mr. Newt Harris. This store had a penny candy assortment that you wouldn't believe. Some items were sold for as little as 10 for a penny and were often placed in a small green and red striped bag. Most of the kids' purchases were a penny and very seldom 5 cents. If a child should produce a dime, he was very apt to be questioned by Mr. Harris as how come he came by that much money. This store building is still standing, but however, it ceased to operate as a grocery store many years ago. The florist shop located on Lucas Street was known as the Greenwood Gardens and was owned and operated by a Mr. George Herman, who grew his flowers in a garden plot adjacent to his flower shop. Cut flowers were sold here as well as floral arrangements. This business flourished for a number of years, but like many small businesses of today, was eventually discontinued. At a later date, the shop was converted into a dwelling. One of the button-cutting shops located on the hill was situated at the rear of a residence on Lucas Street and was owned and operated by a Mr. Fred Grau. This shop employed a number of men living on the hill and for many years, but being affected by the decline of the pearl button industry, finally closed its doors. The other button shop mentioned was located at a residence on Newell Avenue and was owned by a Mr. William Bolt. This shop employed many hillmen, but was destined to go the way of other small button shops, and its operation also was discontinued. The salve manufacturing business was located in the rear of a home on Lucas Street and was owned and operated by a Mr. Wilkins. The formula for the salve was known only to Mr. Wilkins. However, one of the basic ingredients was red clover blossoms. This bit of information was well known by the hill kids who supplied the clover blossoms. As soon as Mr. Wilkins made known that he was in the market for the blossoms, and when the blooms were at their finest, the kids went scurrying to the nearest clover field, which were in abundance in those days. It wasn't all surprising on occasion to see a child with one of his mother's pillowcases, perhaps surprising to his mother, however. Bee stings were common to the barefoot boys as they went among the clover blooms that would be alive with bees. The kids didn't apply Wilkins salve to the stings, as you would imagine, but their relief was from the sting was found in application of mud, which is everywhere apparent, being that there were dirt roads all around. Mud was, the prick clover would be eventually delivered to Mr. Wilkins' shop, and he would proceed to weigh them and pay accordingly so much per pound. The price per pound was never quite clear to the young salesman, nor was he too much concerned. He would take the few proffered coins and merrily hie to the nearest candy store. The poultry farm that was located on Lucas Street was known as the Iowa Poultry Farm and was owned and operated by a Mr. Earl Duncan. Mr. Duncan bought live poultry and also raised some of his own. He also had a thriving business selling dressed poultry for many years. Eventually, this operation was discontinued. Sometime later, a nightclub sprung into being at this same location, the club being appropriately named the Chickadee Inn. This night spot was short-lived, however, as it was forcibly closed by the city fathers, being that some of the roosters crowed too loudly on a Saturday night. During this era, cigar smoking was very popular on the hill, and the hill could at this time boast of 2 cigar makers who plied their trade there. One of these cigar makers was a Mr. Gus Horst, who made his cigars in a small shop located in his home on Logan Street. The other cigar manufacturer was a Mr. William Theobald, who perfected his product in a small shop located in the rear of his home on Clymer Street. It was very interesting to observe these men at work. Starting with various tobacco leaves, the men would roll these leaves together and the cigar seemed to appear like magic in their hands. These skilled men had a brand name for their cigars. Unfortunately, I can only recall one brand name, which was made by Mr. Horst, and it was called the Boost. As the years grew on and the making of cigars by machine by the large tobacco companies, these small businesses couldn't compete and eventually ceased to ply their trade. There was another business that flourished for a time on Lucas Street, which was engaged in making chiropractic tables. This business operated in the rear of a residence of a Mr. Williams, who owned this operation. The volume of business contracted by Williams finally outgrew the manufacturing capacity of this small shop and eventually moved out of state. An additional source of income a hill kid could rely upon was the ragman, who periodically canvassed the neighborhood, yelling, "Any rags, bones, or bottles to sell?" As one who experienced these transactions of rag selling, I have the vague notion that I was never overpaid. The ragman would have his ever-present scale and would weigh each rag bag. Then, through his own complicated computation, would inform the young salesman of his apparent wealth, perhaps from 6 to 10 cents. However, as long as the boy had these coins in his sandy pocket, he neither questioned the weight nor the going price of rags, for having this newly acquired wealth made him king of the hill. Former hill dwellers might also recall the peddlers who came to the hill to hawk their wares. Some were regular visitors, while others were transients who came to sell items of produce that were in season at that time. Items offered for sale would have been sweet corn, tomatoes, potatoes, sweet potatoes, melons, and apples. One of the regular fruit peddlers was a Mr. Brace, remembered for his mule-drawn wagon. Another regular peddler who came to the hill with his meat wagon on wheels was a Mr. Bloss, who announced his presence in the neighborhood by his clanging bell. Mr. Bloss was a butcher by trade and came offering fresh meat for sale. His bell would summon housewives to the curb clutching a dinner plate used to hold their 15-cent slice of meat, usually round steak, and was known in German as Rindfleisch. At times, some of these women would be accompanied by one or two youngsters clutching at their skirts, kids hopefully expecting a free weenie from Mr. Bloss, which was his custom to give. Then, of course, there was Rosamond's ice wagon, a huge, lumbering, horse-drawn vehicle. One can recall how huge this wagon seemed to be on the inside in the eyes of a small boy. Also, how dark and damp it seemed to the boy as he crept inside to snitch a wee bit of ice. In the eyes of his imagination, he could see murky figures lurking in the dark. At this point in time, ice boxes were the only means of refrigeration. Very few of the ice boxes were of a standard size. This entailed the iceman's chipping and shaping of each block of ice to fit each customer's ice chest. The exact dimension of each piece of ice was recorded in the catalog of his memory. This ice was river ice that was harvested in the winter and stored in an ice house. These huge cakes of ice were piled one upon the other with sawdust or straw placed in between the cakes and around them. This procedure was used to retard thawing of the ice. An ice house that was very well known at this time would have been Smith's Ice House, which was located near Weed Park. Also included in door-to-door deliveries were several dairies that delivered milk to the hill. The milk was contained in pint and quart bottles, with the cream in the neck of the bottle sitting on top of the milk. A common practice of the customers was to place a nickel in an empty bottle and place it on their doorstep at night. This prompted the milkman to replace it with a full bottle of milk the following morning. There were also door-to-door collectors during this era. One can recall the Muscatine Journal collector making his rounds each week to collect the 10-cent charge for the daily paper. Another collector that was regular in the neighborhood would have been the insurance man, who went from house to house collecting his premiums for the family insurance. One of the most celebrated holidays of that era on the hill was Memorial Day, known to the hill people as Decoration Day. This was a day that Greenwood Cemetery Chapel would be festooned with flags, large flags, and medium-sized flags, and small flags, all waving gracefully in the breeze. The main drive of the cemetery would be lined on both sides with bridal wreath bushes covered with white blossoms in grand array. These bushes seem to have had a timetable all of their own, as they never failed to be in full bloom on Decoration Day. On this day, people would arrive in the early morning to decorate the resting places of their loved ones. Some would meet friends or relatives that were perhaps not seen other than on these yearly occasions. This decorating by various individuals would continue throughout the day. Some families were known to bring their lunches so as to make a day of it. The high point of the day would be to attend the military services held during the morning at the Veterans Soldier Plot. All through the day until the dust settled at night, people could be seen coming and going from Greenwood, some perhaps not returning until the following year. One can recall the horse-drawn hearses used for the funerals during this era. The hearses were black in color with glass panels on the side, which were usually covered with drapes. The hearse was drawn by a team of horses, which were usually black in color also. The driver of the team would sit perched on top of the hearse as he drove his team to the burial site. There is supposedly a true story involving one of these hearse drivers. It seems this driver had just pulled up to the burial site where the burial rites were to take place. One of the horses was rather frisky and wouldn't stand still. The driver, forgetting momentarily of the occasion and the location, swore at the horse, yelling, "Stand still, you blankety blank." The preacher in charge of the burial service was standing nearby, and overhearing the driver, he walked slowly over to the driver and said, "Bill, what's the other horse's name?" During this early period, several sections of the cemetery were used by Hill residents as shortcuts. These shortcuts led to various parts of South End. There were perhaps 4 or 5 paths leading from the cemetery down over the hill to different sections of Muscatine. Men working at Roach and Musser's and those working in various button factories used these shortcuts daily. A story told by some of the old-timers of West Hill involved a young man named Fred, who at this time was paying court to his girlfriend who lived in South End. This young man would visit his girl at night using one of the cemetery shortcuts. One of the young man's close friends decided to play a trick on his buddy, Fred, knowing that Fred's nightly routine of coming home through the cemetery. He chose a dark night to hide behind one of the tombstones to wait for Fred's passing. True to form, Fred came up over the hill, passing by the stone where his friend was hiding. Allowing a short time to elapse, the friend fell in behind Fred, not even trying to muffle his footsteps. Fred soon became aware of the footsteps behind him and, becoming alarmed, proceeded to walk faster. So did the footsteps. Becoming more frightened, Fred broke into a run, and so did the footsteps. After running at late, Fred became more frightened and sat down on a tombstone to rest. As he did so, a voice came out of the darkness, "Fred, we sure were going some, weren't we?" And Fred yelled back, "We sure were, and as soon as I get my breath, we're gonna go some more." This was an era of dirty, dusty streets, penny pencils, and 5-cent cigars, of church bells chiming, calling people to worship service, of factory whistles announcing the beginning and end of an honest day's work. Whistles that also were regulated for the setting of clocks and watches, and also for the setting of the dining table. It was also common during these years for parents to raise large families. There were 25 kids on my block. Of course, that's counting both sides of the street. To my knowledge, none of these kids became rich or famous, but grew through the periods of peer pressure and puberty, totally unaware of the terms generation gap and juvenile delinquency. They grew into adults and at their appointed time entered into marriage, became responsible parents and law-abiding citizens in their respective communities. During this period, Hill residents found their own fun and entertainment. For the wives, there were quilting bees, coffee clutches, and of course there was over the backyard fence conversation as they hung out the wash or weeded the garden. One of the favorite pastimes for men was horseshoe pitching. One can recall a popular horseshoe pitching court located at the corner of 8th and Lucas Street. Most of the pitching took place in the evening, being that the court was lighted, allowing the men to play at night. Their lighting wasn't as we know lighting today, however. A player could see the sandbox that held a stake, but it took a keen eye to actually see the stake. I often thought that the men aimed their shoe and took Kentucky windage and let fly. Through the summer months, if one was in the neighborhood, he could hear the clanging of the shoe striking the steel stake as these men played this game where close does count. Adjacent to this horseshoe court was located the streetcar switch that allowed streetcars coming from opposite directions to pass each other. If one car was a bit late, the other car would of course have to wait for its arrival, perhaps treating the passengers to a game of horseshoe. Another source of entertainment was found at Nine Houses Pond. This fair-sized pond was located in the area now occupied by the veteran soldiers' plot in the Greenwood Cemetery. Originally, this site was included in a large pasture owned by Mr. Billy Ninehouse. The pond was a source of fun for the hill kids, especially in the summertime. There was crawdad catching and wading to help pass those lazy summer days. In the winter, the frozen ponds provided skating for grown-ups as well as for the kids. One can remember the huge bonfires built to warm hands and feet, and also brought to mind the graceful silhouettes gliding across the ice as the skaters glided by the fire. Some of the most graceful skaters seemed to be those who migrated from Holland, some using skates they had brought from their mother country. This pond eventually was tiled and drained, leaving but a memory of the activities once held there. Some of the games the hill kids played for entertainment are of course unheard of today. To name a few, there was shinny, duck on davy, Washington Star, and run sheep run. Shinny was a poor man's version of ice hockey, although it was played without skates or ice. The puck was a much battered tin can, and the stick would have been a broomstick or a small tree branch. Having chosen sides and placed goal lines, which was usually a line drawn across the dirt street, the can was centered between the goal lines, and the captain squared off as in ice hockey. To make a score, one had to knock the can across the opponent's goal line. After the game, there were many sore and bruised shins, hence the name shinny. Duck on davy was played by placing a tin can on a brick in the middle of the street, and some unlucky player had to be it, as in tag. The player who was it had to stand beside the can as other players tossed a piece of brick in an attempt to dislodge the can. As the can was overturned, the it player had to replace the can, and then who was it had to play the game, and the beat went on. Washington Star and Run Sheep Run was played similar to hide and seek, with some additional rules and changes. West Hill has undergone many changes through the years that have faded into the mist of time, some out of necessity, others for the sake of progress, as they say. Perhaps a former Hill resident viewing these changes might muse, was it ever so? God has permitted us to have memories that we can enjoy and also share with others, perhaps for their enjoyment also. Thus, I have attempted to share some of these memories of life on the hill that was lived in a bygone era in the good old days on West Hill. I hope these remarks have proven to be interesting, or better still, brought to the fore some of your memories that have faded with the years. If our memories couldn't be recalled, it would seem as if we hadn't lived those years at all. Many of our minds are likened to attics heavy with old dreams and spent history, but a person isn't old until regrets take the place of dreams. We thank you for tuning us in, and we hope that you will continue to do so. I would like to leave you with this observation. Two of mankind's most pressing problems are how to keep half of the population from starving and the other half from eating too much. Until next time, we will see you on Cablevision, Channel 26.